Alright guys, welcome back to Aussie Arvos. Today we're back working on the patrol again. We've got plenty to do in all different areas, so we might as well just get stuck straight on into it, stop beating around the bush and get some stuff done. Alright, so we're going to start today by pulling apart the front diff. I am going to be checking the bearings. Now, I did briefly check them just out of curiosity with the tyre on to see if I could feel any play in them, and they do actually feel pretty tight, but obviously being diffs that I don't know the condition of and that have been, I think they were sitting for a long time before even I picked them up, I'm obviously going to want to check those bearings and make sure they've got grease in them, and chances are I'm going to be replacing them anyway. So we're going to pull apart the front assembly down to the bearings. Also note now, I'm not planning on doing a full swivel hub rebuild. These things are bone dry, like there's not a speck of grease on them, so I'm assuming the inner axle seals are good. You know what they say, if it's not broke, don't fix it sort of thing. So I'm not going to be doing the swivel hub rebuild complete. And yeah, hopefully once I start driving it, they don't just start weeping all of a sudden, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So for now, we'll start pulling everything off, get down to the bearings, and then we can assess what the condition's like. We'll also, while we've got this apart, also be throwing on new rotors and new pads because they're a little bit worn. Alright, so I'm pulling off the hub first. Now you'll notice that these diffs came with auto locking hubs, which came on like the top of the range models, I think, and some of the other ones. And like, while they work, they're not like a lot of people do run them, but I don't think they're the strongest. And also it's good to be able to go into low range sometimes and not have four-wheel drive engage. So yeah, so I will be replacing these in the final build with my manual hubs that are on my Leafy, because they bolt straight over. So we're not going to be going auto hubs for the final build, but just for today, I will chuck these back on just to cover up the axle again. So just to keep it all protected until we can have the manual hubs ready to go off of my ute. All right, so there, I've never actually seen the inside of an auto locking hub, but essentially once you take this off from their back, it's all the same regardless of manual hub or auto hub. First inspection, doesn't look like they've been re-greased in a while, which is probably right, but it doesn't look like there's any moisture in there. So I think it's all just grease, which is good. So yeah, oftentimes you'll find in patrol, so on the bearing retainer, you have these little screws that hold it in place, and the heads, I don't know why they use a Phillips head. They should use like an Allen key or something, but they always usually strip out. But these ones are in good condition, which is great. So that's like your lock washer, which the screws hold in. And then you have your actual bearing nut. So patrol owner, if you're ever going to do any work on your own car, you'll need one of these. So this is an actual bearing lock nut tool. So it's specially designed for a half-inch drive, and it's got these two little like locators, or dowels, sorry. And they're pretty much how you're going to undo this and take your bearings out. All right. So there's our outer wheel bearing, and straight away, so when you're inspecting, seeing if the wheel bearings, how good they are, you want to just look for any signs of wear. So if you can't see anything on the rollers of the actual bearing, which these actually look pretty good, the next one to check is the race on that the bearing's obviously running on. So you see, I can't even see marks of where the rollers have been sitting. So, you know, funnily enough, you probably, like if you didn't already have the stuff, because we already do have the stuff, you just about put some fresh grease in these and keep going. But we're going to be replacing it all because, yeah, I don't have to worry about it. I'll just know that they're new bearings. So I'm going to be replacing it, so we won't have to worry about that. So there's our seal, and there's our other bearing. So again, they all look pretty sweet. They honestly were probably pretty good. I don't think the discs were meant to have done very many hard Ks. So they're probably all pretty sweet. So then we need to punch out the race. So there's our bottom bearing race. I don't even know if that's budged yet.
While I was stuffing around trying to get the bearing races out of the hub, I got Patrick to start tearing down the other side of the axle. I was having all sorts of trouble trying to get this bearing race out of the hub. Even trying to use a bit of heat on the outside to expand the hub didn't help at all, so I ended up having to change tools.
Well, bit of a learning curve there. So I reckon I went at it with brass for what, probably 45 minutes?
Maybe even longer.
And I snapped my brass drift. I tried a few other different bits of brass with like steel punches through them, and then Patrick's like, you need to use steel, because it was just mashing the brass. And I was like, I've only ever, and like, keep in mind, every time I've done it on my patrol, my dad's patrol, always just use brass to punch them out, and it usually works. But these were obviously very stiff, and the reason I didn't want to use a steel punch is because I'm just cautious of damaging the hub housing, because yeah, you can put a big score or a big nick in the hub, so you really want to use brass because it's softer. But obviously in this case, these were too tight to the point where the strength to push this out was more than the force that the brass could withstand. So essentially, I was just beating a dead horse. So, and sure enough, as soon as Patrick said, just have a good go with a steel punch, and I was like, all right, and sure enough, it came out like straight away. So, lesson learned. Sometimes, if you can do it with brass, I think it's preferable, but sometimes you just got to go with something stronger. So, all right, finally, let's do the other one. So sick of doing bearings on cars. Like, I reckon, put it this way, I reckon I've only ever I've done 40,000 kilometers in my patrol. I reckon I've replaced bearings in cars like 5 times. Oh, it's so annoying. I hate it.
With all the old bearings finally punched out of the hubs, I could separate the rotor from the hub and get it ready to be cleaned up. When it comes to cleaning components, I'm super critical and make sure to clean every surface as best I can. You got to make sure that the seating surfaces of the bearings inside the hub are free of any sort of grime. You don't want anything stopping you from pressing those bearing races all the way into the hub.
All right, so we finally got those hubs disassembled. We've taken the rotors off the hubs as well. So before we start throwing the bearings back together, I'm just going to run you through the rotors on the brakes that I'm using on the new build. So sitting in front of me, we've got the full drive disc rotors from Protex. Now these are a pretty good bit of kit. They're not your standard rotor, so they are slotted. You can see it's got the slotting, obviously aids in cooling and also just prolonging pad life. I don't know if any of you remember when I went through while I was doing this whole thing as well, I did mention how poor my brakes are in the Leafy. Especially with the drum rear as well, they just weren't crash hot. So I'm definitely aiming to have good brakes for this build. So I think these will definitely be crucial. And then obviously to go with the discs as well, we've also got Protex brakes, full drive brake pads as well that we'll be throwing in, as well as the Protex sorted out some braided extended lines as well. So between all of that, I think our braking should be pretty spot on. So we'll get these bolted up to the hubs, then we can get all the bearings in and then get everything back on the car and move on to the rear. Let's do it. All right, this is just a homemade jig, just to pretty much allow you to have something to brace against the rotor so that you can torque it. Because obviously you can use a gun, but you can't put a torque spec on it if you don't have something to brace against it. So we just stick that rod through there and then get the torque wrench, just set to 68 Newton meters, and then fire away.
So now that the hub and rotors were assembled back together, we could begin installing the new bearings into the hub. So I just used a bearing drive kit to punch in the new bearing races, and then I could get started on packing the new bearings to be installed.
All right, so I'm just packing the bearings. I put gloves on because it's a lot smarter, because it's a very messy process when you're doing it by hand. And I think I've explained once before how this sort of works, but essentially just getting a bunch of grease in the palm of your hand, and then you want the grease to run up between all of these, the actual bearings, like the rollers. So if you use a motion, sort of like where you're forcing grease up into it, like so, forcing grease between all those rollers, and then you'll see in here, see how it started bubbling through? That means you've got worked the grease up right between all the rollers. So you can get little things that like container things where you like press it and it does it, or some people use grease needles on like a motorized grease gun, and that makes it easy, but we're doing things the old-fashioned way. But definitely recommend a set of gloves. I never used to use gloves, but it's way better if you use gloves, and it's just better for your skin because this stuff's like toxic for you pretty much.
I then greased up the new outer axle seals and punched them into the hub, and also gave the stub axle a clean and greased it up, ready for our hub and rotor to be installed.
All right, so we're ready to chuck the hub and the new disc back on. Yeah, I've just put some grease over the spindle. And here we go, everything's in. Obviously I've got to sleeve the front bearing, the outer bearing over once I've got this on. So we'll do that. All right, so then we get the bearing that we packed before, and that we've already got our other race obviously sitting in there, and that should go in just like that. All right, so I'm just gonna set the preload on the bearing. So when you do your final tighten up on everything before you put it back together, the lock nut torque spec's only like 5 Newton meters because you only just want it holding it there. But prior to that, you need to preload the bearing and have it seated all the way in. So you'll actually do it pretty tight to lock it in. Oh yeah, so that sits there, starting to tighten up. After consolidating the Patrol manual, so the bearing preload is 196 Newton meters, which my torque wrench doesn't even go that high. So it pretty much just means tight as all buggery. Like that. And then you back it off to 0, all spinning good. And then it's only tighten, your final tighten is only 5 Newton meters. So you can imagine how little 5 Newton meters is. Like, that's probably it there. That's probably even too tight. And I've literally just put the weight of my arm on it. But the thing is with Patrols, you're actually you got to align the lock. You got to get it in a spot where when you sit your lock nut or your lock washer on, it aligns so you can put the screws through. So that's what we got to do. Almost directly either side. Yeah, she spins. So I've put the auto hubs back on just because I don't have the manual hubs off my car yet. And so I've just whacked these on temporarily. I'm not going to do them up tight or anything. And also I haven't greased all the inside behind here because when you change the manual hubs, you've got to swap a few components and add a few components, which will require re-greasing and pulling apart. So there's no point putting in any grease yet. This was just so that the bearings are all done. All right, so we're ready to throw the pads in. So the pads we've got the Protex Ultra 4-wheel drive brake pads. Yeah, look good. So we'll chuck them in, and it also comes with some anti-squeal stuff, so we'll chuck that on the back of the pads as well. That'll just stop any squeal from the pistons on the pad. So yeah, all very good. We'll go chuck these in.
I'm really looking forward to seeing how these new brakes perform. Coming from the old leaf-sprung ute to now a 4-wheel disc brake setup will be a huge improvement that I think will dramatically improve the performance of the car.
All right, so as part of the full brake upgrade, we're also upgrading and replacing lines where needed. So I've got all the lines from Protex, they've sorted that out as well. So we're just going to chuck in now the side brake lines, so the ones that just run from the hard line to the caliper. So we've got them there. We've also got that for the rear. We've also got extended braided brake lines for the front. So being a 3-inch lift and also having probably extra suspension travel, we're going to need a longer brake line because those short ones in the factory ones ain't going to cut it. So we've got 5 to 6 inch extended braided brake lines as well, but I'm not going to chuck these in just yet because I don't have the hard lines, I don't want stuff being able to fall into them. So we'll wait until we've got the hard lines on. But yeah, for now we'll chuck on these short side ones, and yeah, it should be good.
With the front brake lines installed, I threw the wheels back on and dropped the front end down, ready to move on and tackle what I thought would be a 1-day job, but turned into a 1-week job. Moving on to the rear end, we're ready to again replace the rotors, brake lines, brake pads and wheel bearings. But on the rear end of a Patrol, to replace the bearings, you have to remove the entire axle from the diff housing.
All right, so I've just pulled the rear axle out. As you can see there, it's much easier and faster than the front. It's literally like 6 bolts on the backside, pull the caliper off and knock the disc off, and then it comes straight out. So super easy. It all looks in good condition, but we'll have to now get the bearing off the axle and out of the hub, which is pretty easy. There's just a lock nut there that we'll pull off, and then we'll just have to separate the hub. Hopefully it doesn't put up too much of a fight, but it should drop off fairly easily. So yeah, we'll do that. I just had a quick look in here, and the axle seal looks good. There's no oil inside. All the grease around the outside still looks in really good condition, which is a good sign. Probably almost could have left them, but this is the sort of thing that's, when you get anything that's unknown, it's good to go through all this stuff, because the other side might be a whole different story. So anyway, we'll get the bearing out of that hub over there, and then we can start replacing.
Since we have a lot of patrols at our home, we've got a bit of a custom rig that we use to replace rear wheel bearings.
All right, so we've got the hub here. We've got it sitting in a homemade jig, and this is to allow us to undo that bearing lock nut. Now, these are done up really tight. So essentially what we've got going on here is it's just a steel rim, and it's got just a bit of C-channel welded so that we can clamp it into the vise. And then we just bolt the axle to the wheel. So this isn't going anywhere, it's sturdy. And then pretty much we've got, this is a custom made, I suppose you just call it a big, socket for the lock nut on here. So this slides over the top like so, and it is the same size as that nut, and then that allows us to undo it. So yeah, it's a bit of a setup, but it's needed because these things are bloody tight. So, all right, let's see if we can do this. Huh. That was easy. I might have a lot of people just do it with a chisel, and that probably would have worked. Wow, all that just for it to literally come off that easy. Oh well, I think it's more maybe even the tightening up where you got to seat the bearing. All right, so we've got the lock nut and washer off, and now the hard part is often getting the actual hub off the axle, because the bearing's like pressed on, as you can imagine. It can get it can seat pretty tightly on the axle. So we've got to unbolt the axle, flip it upside down, and give it a few knocks, and hopefully that hub falls off. Needs to separate from the axle, so it can sometimes take a bit of banging. Hopefully these all hold. Surely. Never easy. It came off that easy, and then sure enough, it's like, all right, so we have had no such luck with the axle. So obviously started with the Belton on the wood block. That normally works. That's what I've done all the other times I've replaced in my car, my old man's car. But this one is unusually tight. So we had the bearing pullers hooked up, no budging at all. We then moved on to put heat right around the hub, just to try get it to expand a bit, and giving it plenty of wax with the hammer, but still no luck. So I'm honestly not sure what we do at this point. I think we're gonna need a actual shop spec hydraulic press. But yeah, I'll have to find someone that has one of those because we don't. So yeah, we sort of hit a fork in the road. All right, so I've been stuffing around with the other axle, which we're still having trouble with. Paddy's pulled out the other one, and when he's pulled out, he's noticed that there is an abundance of oil and washed out grease inside this housing. So essentially what that means is the inner axle seal is kaput. So I believe I do have a spare one. So we'll swap that out, and then we'll take this axle and see if we can get the hub off of this one. Man, this one looks a bit more like it. Oh no, still not crazy tight. All right, so fast forward a few days, we are now here with our completed axle assemblies. We had a friend that had a shop press, just like a cheap thing, but it was 20 ton, and it did it very easily compared to the efforts we were going to. So I've got the bearings now all seated in the new hubs, all reassembled and greased. All I got to do is throw the lock washers and the lock nuts on, and then we can slot them back into the car. So let's go do that. All right, so just about to tighten these up. Now the torque spec for the nut that holds or that tightens your bearings is 490 Newton meters. Now, to any of you that know how much that is, that's pretty much like one of the highest torque specs in the whole car, pretty much, just about. So yeah, we don't have a torque wrench that goes that high, so pretty much this comes back to this big bar that we've got, and it pretty much just means you just hang off it as hard as you can, essentially. So that's what we're gonna be doing. All right, so while I've got it all apart, also gonna do the inner axle seals. This side was fine, it wasn't leaking, but the other side had a pretty decent leak. So we're just gonna do both sides while we're here. All right, so we've got our new inner axle seal, so we'll punch this in, and then once that's in, we can slide the axles in. Perfect. All right. Axle seals are in. Now we'll get grubby and we will put these in.
With the rear axle assembly finally back together, we could put the rotors on and the new pads to go with it. Although the diffs I purchased did come with brake lines that I thought were in decent condition, I didn't want to take any chances when it came to braking, so I installed new rubber brake lines on both sides.
All right, so we've got the car back in a rolling state. I've just chucked on the brake lines that go on either end of the axle. Still haven't done the center ones yet, just because I haven't got the hard lines plumbed up ready yet. So yeah, that'll be next, the hard lines, and then once we've done that, we can start throwing in fuel tanks and things and really get underway with the turning into a car.
Next time on the patrol build, we start tearing down the leaf sprung patrol. We got all sorts of stuff to pull off this thing to transfer over to the new chassis. So make sure you leave a like, leave a comment, and get subscribed and ready for the next one.